Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and our students as well. I'm Tom Coletti, Assistant Principal here at John Glenn High School. Welcome this evening. Thanks for coming out. We have a presentation this evening by Dr. Stephen Dewey. Today he did an assembly at the middle school, and we did two here, separate, one for 9th and 10th grade and one for 11th and 12th, on the effects of alcohol, drugs, vaping on our youth. And we think it's a very, very important presentation, and that's why we have this workshop here this evening, this presentation for you this evening. We're glad to see a lot of our students here. And at this time, I would also like to thank the support of our superintendent, Dr. Ken Bosser, who's here this evening. Also, our Board of Education member, Mr. James Tomio. And the rest of our board members who are always very, very supportive of everything we do here at Elwood, especially here at John Glenn High School. So, without further ado, I am going to introduce my counterpart here, Mr. Dave Shanahan, who's going to give you a little background on Dr. Dewey, and then we'll get on with the presentation. In a minute. Mr. Shanahan.
Thank you, Mr. Coletti. We'd be remiss if I did not welcome Mrs. Marcus. I know you're here, I saw you coming. Welcome, Board of Education member. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. I think tonight you're going to find our presentation, it's very scientific based, very factual based. The way it's presented to the students is, here is the knowledge of what's going on with drugs in your brain and how certain people respond to it or certain people do not get involved with drugs, and this is what their brain is going to look like. Conversely, if you go make that choice to use drugs, this is what your brain is going to look like in the road of addiction. It's very, very powerful. Today I learned 4, 5, 6 things I didn't know myself. I'm a health teacher. So with that being said, I'd like to do a little introduction. Dr. Stephen Dewey, Department of Psychiatry, NYU School of Medicine, Director of Research Education, Seafield Center. Dr. Stephen L. Dewey received his PhD from the University of Iowa. He completed his postdoctoral fellowship in neurology department at Stony Brook University. During his tenure at Brookhaven National Laboratory, Dr. Dewey conducted research on the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain. These studies led to the development of effective treatment for addiction that are currently in clinical trials. So I'd like to welcome, he's got a great presentation, Dr. Dewey.
Well, thank you for letting me come and talk to you tonight a little bit about the work I do. I want to say a special hello to my brother, Dr. Dewey, who's watching in his house far away from here. I just want to say hi, Scott. Anyway, okay, so I had the opportunity this afternoon to speak to your kids, and I must tell you, the questions they asked were amazing. I spoke to the middle school, and we couldn't answer all the questions. I couldn't answer them all. In the high school, the questions were, I've been doing this for a long time. The questions were absolutely amazing. So it's a credit to your kids. They listened. They had a lot of important questions. They wanted to know the information. And what I thought I would do is share with you what it is that I've been doing for a long time, and that is studying the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain. I've been interested in this for a long period of time, and we've been studying this for many, many years. And it's a research-based presentation. I'm just going to show you some science. I'll try to make it as simple as I can. I'm obviously really laid back, so I hope you'll ask questions. If you have them, don't wait to the end. And if I can answer them, I will. And if I can't, I'll tell you that too. So the work we do is to investigate the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain. I don't go to schools and tell people that drugs are bad and don't do drugs. I just show them some science so they can get a sense of what goes on. Many of the kids have misinformation that we try to correct, and information that's just lacking that we try to give. And that's kind of what I want to do tonight. So, The imaging work that we do is all based on people coming to us as volunteers. Everybody who comes to us to be scanned comes as a volunteer. No one comes because they have to, no one comes because they're mandated. Everyone who gets involved in our research program does so as a volunteer. And it's not unlike other research programs, right? People get involved in research in lupus and diabetes and all kinds of cancer. So it's not unique. It's consistent with the research world, and specifically the biochemical or the biomedical research. So, we'll talk a little bit about drugs. We'll talk a little bit about this disease of addiction. And I'll show you what I showed you kids. We'll step it up a little bit. We'll touch on a couple of things that we didn't touch on for the students this afternoon. And again, if you have questions, ask. So, the work that I do, I use a typical imaging technique. Everyone is aware, knows the conventional imaging techniques that are out there. CT, X-ray, and MR. These are essentially cameras that take pictures of how your body looks. So these are anatomical imaging techniques, and they show us, they teach us something about the anatomy of the human body. So that's not anything new. It's pretty, you guys have, many of you probably had CT scans or X-rays or MRs. Take-home message is these are anatomical imaging techniques. But if we want to study a disease that's origin is not anatomical, but functional or physiological, we need a different kind of camera. So, the camera that I use is called a PET scanner. It stands for Positron Emission Tomography. It's a medical imaging technique that was developed at Brookhaven Lab in 1960. And it came to its clinical utility about 5, 6, 7 years ago, where it's now the #1 imaging tool for cancer. Because what it does is it allows us to see how the body lives, not how the body looks. And if you think about a disease, any disease you can think of, represents a change in function before it represents a change in anatomy. So, a disease will have a physiologic origin that may, as the disease progresses, produce anatomical changes that we can see, which means anatomical imaging is kind of late in the game. So when we look at a tumor in someone's liver, we don't really see them until they're big enough to be seen. If we look at a disease called multiple sclerosis in a young girl, these little white spots, or the disease of MS, again, the images don't become significant until the disease is big enough or is advanced enough so that we can see it. And of course, a compound fracture of the forearm, right, it's pretty textbook. So we need a camera that shows function. That camera is a PET scanner. It stands for Positron Emission Tomography, and it is a functional imaging technique, which means it's not going to give us anatomical images, it's going to give us functional images. So the consequence is we can see diseases well before they appear on anatomical scans. PET scans are really simple to read. You won't have any trouble. They're presented in color simply because it makes it easier for us to explain them and you to interpret them. You just remember colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Red represents one extreme, violet the other. So when you look at a PET scan, when you see an area of red, that's part of the brain that's highly functional. And just functionality here is sugar metabolism, glucose. Areas of yellow and green, less activity. Violet, black, no activity. So it's really simple. If I put you in a PET scanner and I put a tennis ball in your left hand, and you squeeze that tennis ball for the 8 minutes the scan takes, at the end of that 8 minutes, I'll see a red spot over the part of your brain that runs your left hand. So it's pretty simple. We can obviously make it much more complicated. We do a lot of studies. We're interested in pain. So a lot of studies are done looking at pain. I told the kids today, we put kids in pain. We bring them to the imaging center, put them in the PET camera, put their hand on the table and slam it with a hammer. Everyone laughed. We don't do that. So that's not what we do. But we do use pain models that are pretty standard in this business. And the pain model is a standard ice bucket that you put your hand in, right? For 10 seconds or 15 seconds, it hurts. So that gives us a metabolic signature or a signature of pain in the brain. Well, that becomes really important because now we can look at medications that treat that pain, We can look at medications that might not be targeted initially for pain management, but seem to work for pain management. So it allows us to do a lot of things with medication development that we couldn't do before, because it lets us look not only at the efficacy or how a drug works, but at what dose a drug works. So one of the things that's I told your kids today that's really important is this disease of addiction is one that covers the lifespan. So young patients as young as 9 years old are drinking a quart of gin a day. These are fourth graders. So we have kids that are that young. We have people in their 80s abusing methamphetamine. So this is a disease that exists throughout our lifespan. And it can show up or become apparent pretty much any time in that lifespan. We have 7th graders who are injecting heroin. We have 8th graders and 9th graders who are using ecstasy, right? Kids smoking pot in 6th grade. So that's nothing new, it's nothing we didn't know. We now have a much better handle, though, on the underlying changes in the brain that, one, produce the disease, and two, underlie its progression. So, 3 PET scans, 3 normal people, obviously very different. On the left is a 5-day-old baby. Well, that makes sense. There isn't anyone in this room who can remember being 5 days old, despite what I get told. Kids have told me they can remember being born. Right? It was dark, and then it was light, right? You hear that? They can't, because, right, you don't have the metabolic machinery to store a memory. This is a 6-year-old boy. Eyes are on top on all 3 images. 6-year-olds are really active. Their brains are really active. So it makes sense that a 6-year-old kid has got a really active brain. Right? We all know 6-year-olds. They run around. They pick on their brother or sister. They pull the dog's tail. We know what 6-year-olds do, right? This is us. As we get older, that's what we have to look forward to. As we age, our brain metabolism decreases. That's a normal event. That's what's supposed to happen. So, we have a pretty good profile, a pretty good understanding of how the brain ages, how brain metabolism ages, and we have a really good understanding of what to expect in terms of each decade of life, what your metabolic rate should be. Well, that's important for me in my business because I have patients who are really young and patients who are really old. And if I'm going to look at a 6th grader who's an alcoholic, I have to compare that 6th grader to a 6th grader who isn't. I can't compare a 6th grader to someone in their 20s because age changes the brain so much. So all the images you'll see are scanned against or compared to age-matched controls. So it's really simple. All the images you're going to see are compared to the same age individual who isn't using the drug. So if you've never seen a PET scanner, this is a brand new PET scanner, a whole body machine. The gantry, the opening is big enough for a whole body. Our volunteers lie on this bed, and this machine is dedicated for research. So we're going to make a couple of statements about the disease and about drugs of abuse. The disease of addiction is one that is caused by and the consequence of a change in a chemical in your brain called dopamine. Everybody in this room, everybody on the planet has dopamine in their brain. It's a neurotransmitter, it's a chemical your brain makes. I can't give it to you in a pill, I can't put it in a syringe, I can't put it in a cup, I can't give it to you. It's a chemical your brain makes. Its primary role is movement. So every time you move, your brain has to make and release dopamine. It's really simple. You want to move your hand, your brain releases dopamine. So, if you just think about the movements, whether it's breathing, your heart beating, moving your hands, your feet, your eyelids, whatever it is, blinking, you need dopamine to move. When you lose dopamine, either as a consequence of drug abuse or disease, you have movement disorders. The classic movement disorders is Parkinson's. And all the kids know about Muhammad Ali. They remember Muhammad Ali before he died. He had trouble speaking. So as the disease progresses, you lose more and more dopamine. Your ability to move becomes impaired. So movement disorders are classically dopamine. Dopamine also plays, one of your kids, one of the kids said it before I did. Dopamine also makes you happy, doesn't it? Yeah, dopamine is the chemical in your brain responsible for happiness. When you're happy, dopamine levels go up, and when you're sad, they go down. Now it all comes down to the question of magnitude. So a natural reward, and the comparison we used today with the kids was a test score. If they left the auditorium and they went to their next class and they got a 95 on a test, and they're happy about it, they're going to get a 5 or 6% increase in brain dopamine. A natural reward will increase dopamine between 5 and 6%. That's it. The brain is pretty careful on its maintenance and its control of dopamine for obvious reasons. If it goes up a little too much, that'll manifest as a disease called schizophrenia. If it goes down a little too much, that'll manifest as a movement disorder, typical of something like Parkinson's. So the brain keeps a really tight clamp on the amount of dopamine that it releases. So if you're happy, 4 or 5% increase in dopamine is a big effect. Now, happiness is defined as whatever it is for everybody. It's different for everybody, whether it's a test score, being with your friends, Friday afternoon, going to the beach, playing with your dog, whatever it is. It's different for everybody, but the consequence is the same. A natural reward will increase brain dopamine 4 or 5%. Every addictive drug that we've ever studied works by increasing brain dopamine. That's how they work. You take an addictive drug and dopamine levels go up. It's simple. Doesn't matter what the drug is, caffeine or heroin, it raises brain dopamine. The difference is the magnitude of the effect. So the comparison I made today with the kids was they go and they get their math test, they get a 95, their dopamine goes up 4 or 5%, they're happy. They want to celebrate, they leave the school, they go across the street and they use methamphetamine, a drug that's in this district, a drug that's in every district. So they get their 95, they get a 4 or 5% increase in brain dopamine, they leave the building, they go across the street, they use meth. And they use just a couple of milligrams, not much. Their dopamine levels will go up between 950,000 and 1.2 million%. So, drugs of abuse raise dopamine levels far greater than anything else they will experience. The happiest they'll be is going to give them a 5% hit. They use meth, 1 million. Now, the degree to which a drug raises brain dopamine tells us how addictive it is. The most commonly abused drug in the world today is caffeine. Caffeine will raise dopamine about 100, 120%. It's not nearly as addictive as meth. Opiates, heroin, will raise it between 400 to 800,000%. Cocaine, 200 to 600,000%. So the degree that a drug raises dopamine tells us how addictive it is. It's really simple. So the take-home measure is all addictive drugs produce the same neurochemical effect. They do it through different mechanisms, but the same neurochemical effect at the end. They raise dopamine. And they raise dopamine far greater than anything else they're going to experience. So that kind of sets the stage for what we're up against. The happiest you've ever been is a 5% increase. Imagine what it is for the 900,000% increase. It kind of gives you a sense of the magnitude of the issue or the problem you face. So, really simple. All addictive drugs, doesn't matter what it is, raise brain dopamine. And the degree to which they do that tells us how addictive it is. And they do it far greater than anything natural that they're going to experience. So then the next question came, how come some kids get hooked on drugs and some kids don't? So if you look at the epidemiology across the United States, what you find is about 14% of the population suffers from chemical dependency. That's a huge number if you consider 330 million people, 14% is a big number. But it also means 86% of the people don't. So there's something going on. Is it a random thing? Is it global warming? What's going on? So what we did was over the years, we've gone to school districts all over the place asking questions, real simple. How many of you will try anything, and how many of you won't try anything, right? You know these kids. This isn't a surprise. Everyone knows kids who are the adrenaline junkies who will try anything, and it's not just chemicals. It's bungee jumping, it's hot air ballooning, it's hang gliding, it's risky behavior. And you go to schools and you ask kids, we do this all the time, and you'll find answers, right? And so you look at those kids. You take the kids who self-report a willingness to try something novel, and the kids who self-report that there won't. And then you look at them, and you scan them, and here they are. The kid on the left, that I call the control, this is a PET scan, eyes are right on the top. In this PET scan, we are specifically looking at brain dopamine. We can put you in the PET scanner and measure your brain dopamine. The kid on the left are kids who report no interest in trying anything novel. The kid on the right are kids who say they're novelty seeking. They call themselves adrenaline junkies. Well, lo and behold, what we find is there's a difference in the amount of dopamine they have in their brains. That's pretty significant if you keep in mind that the amount of dopamine you have is pretty tightly controlled and it's age dependent. If we have two groups of kids, 1,000 or 1,500 in each group, that are the same age, they should have the same amount of dopamine, and lo and behold, they don't. Kids who self-report a willingness to try something novel have about 5% more dopamine in their brains than their age-matched controls. Also, what does that mean? Does it mean anything? Is it insignificant? Is it random? It's probably not random. What does it mean? Well, so the way you test that is you test it. You simply give them each a shot of alcohol. Give them each a challenge. And lo and behold, what you find is when you give these kids a shot glass of alcohol, their dopamine goes up 950%. It's a lot, but it's consistent with what we know about alcohol. You give the same shot to these kids and it goes up 34,000%. So here we have the first insight into this disease, that your brain dopamine system, your resting dopamine levels, predict your response to a drug that specifically targets it. And what you find is kids who self-report a willingness to try something novel will have a potentiated response to an acute challenge of an addictive drug. That speaks to the disease nature of addiction. It doesn't say, these are not kids who had bad parents, who were hanging out with the wrong kids, who weren't nursed long enough, you know, the things I hear forever. These are kids you can't tell apart. You can't tell them apart. You can't tell them apart based on their socioeconomic upbringing, their parents, who their friends are. These are kids who one kid says, I'll try anything, and one kid says, I won't. And the consequence of that simple behavior is a change in a resting dopamine level. And when you take a drug that specifically targets it, you get a potentiated response. So that was our first insight into the disease nature of addiction. It in fact exists in people before they become addicted. And the mere process of using an addictive substance unmasks the resident disease. Well, that's not unique. We know that many people who have diabetes, but it doesn't show up until they gain too much weight. And once they gain too much weight, their A1C gets too high, and what happens if the doctor says lose weight, you lose weight, and you manage glucose. So it's not unique to addiction that it's a disease that gets unmasked. What's unique is once it's unmasked, we have to manage it. Unlike diabetes, where once it's unmasked, many people can simply lose weight and control it that way. Once you unmask the disease of addiction, now it's something we have to manage. It's not something that's going to go away if you lose weight or anything like that. It's a disease that needs to be managed once it's unmasked. Well, this would have been a perfect story if 14% of the population had this response, but they didn't. Only about 7% did, which means we're missing the other half. Well, we found them. They're right here. Kids who have the disease ADD or ADHD have low brain dopamine. Normal control on your left, kid with ADD on the right. They have low brain dopamine, right? Kids who self-report a willingness to try something novel, higher. Kids who have ADD, low. Well, so we do the same thing. Alcohol challenge. 900 and change here, 34,000 here. Well, so now the story becomes more complete. The story is now that if you have a dopamine system that is altered a little too much or a little too little, your response to a drug that specifically targets it will be altered. And that alteration is what is unmasking the disease. Well, so now that we have that story that's far more compelling, it's not just too much, but it's a change, then we can ask more interesting questions like, what if we medicate this kid? What if we give this kid medications for ADD or ADHD and then re-challenge him? And what we find is exactly what you would expect. When we return these guys' dopamine levels to normal through medications like Vyvanse or Ritalin, and then we challenge them again, we get a 900% here and a 900% here, which means when you manage the disease of ADD or ADHD, you remove the risk of an addictive comorbidity. So, you have kids who have ADD or ADHD, they get medicated, the risk of the comorbid addiction disease goes away. The big risk are two, exactly what you would expect. The kid who's got the greatest risk is this kid who doesn't get medicated. The kid who's got ADD or ADHD who doesn't get medicated, what do? They self-medicate. They drink or they smoke pot and they raise their dopamine levels back to normal, which means they feel normal. So it speaks to this process that we know. It's estimated that as many as 2/3 of people who have unmasked the disease of addiction have done it as a consequence of self-medicating another comorbid disease, which simply means a kid who's depressed, who has low serotonin, low dopamine, drinks alcohol, brings his dopamine or serotonin levels back to normal, medicates the underlying depression, happens to unmask addiction as a consequence, but we know that many kids will self-medicate if they're not treated. Next, the kid who doesn't have ADD or ADHD, but gets medicated for it. Well, what they're doing is they're using a drug that's increasing brain dopamine to a system that's normal to begin with. That raises brain dopamine and starts the process. Where that becomes a problem is, depending on the data you look at, it's estimated that as much as 30% or 85% of people with ADD or ADHD outgrow it by the time they're 18 or 19 years old. Well, if you go away to school with your bottle of medication for ADD or ADHD, and the middle of your freshman year or the beginning of your sophomore year, your dopamine levels are normal, that is, the disease has resolved, but you continue to take the medication for it, now you're taking medication for a disease you no longer have. The liability starts to go up. So it's something that we deal with constantly, where kids who have the disease of ADD or ADHD continue to get medicated even when the disease resolves as a natural consequence of aging. So, you can imagine that we've been very interested in trying to understand what's going on in the world of addiction. We know, and I told your kids, and you can look it up, the biggest risk to your kid's life today is substance abuse. The greatest killer of kids in high school is drug abuse. Used to be car accidents, used to be handguns, used to be normal home accidents. Now it's drug abuse. When I was in graduate school, three kids in 4 years died of a drug overdose. Today, in 2018, we lose 7 kids every hour, every day, to drug abuse. 7 kids an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, are dying from drug abuse. So, people have been trying to find out what's going on. I talk to kids every day, and I hear the same thing. The number one thing I hear is stress. They tell me that I can't appreciate the stress they're under. They say, when I was in high school back in the, when the dinosaurs were there was no stress. I went to Fort Jeff High School. I'm a Fort Jeff graduate. I seem to recall it was stressful as hell when I was in high school. Maybe it wasn't as stressful, but stress is something that's perceived. I thought it was stressful. Kids today tell me it's really stressful and that I can't appreciate the stress associated with high school. So, is it stress? Maybe it's stress. I don't know. So one of the things that people have been looking for is there anything else that can be correlated with? One of the things we've heard is global warming. Maybe it's just a consequence of global warming. I had a kid tell me it was Trump. Because of Trump. I don't know. But the question is there anything else that's increasing at the same rate? I think everybody knows the answer to this. That's not a surprise to anyone. That kids get addicted to the internet. That's not a mystery. There's a whole literature on it. There are hundreds of papers showing what's going on. Kids get addicted to the internet. There's no mystery. They meet DSM-5 criteria for addiction. It's pretty simple. Elegant studies have looked at kids who grew up in the US, who had unlimited access to the internet, but then moved out of the country to countries where they don't have access to the internet as robust, and they see these increases in depression, bipolar disorder, psychosis. Kids go through withdrawal. So maybe that's it. Maybe kids are getting addicted to the internet, and that explains chemical dependency. Well, the data that's out there doesn't really support it. It says that there's a correlation. It says that the rates are about the same. If you actually look at the data, what you find is in the history of the US, 14%, 250 years of our country, about 14% of the population suffers from chemical dependency. That's through the life of our country. In the last 3 years, the number of kids who meet criteria for internet addiction is 15%. So it's already more in 2 years for the internet than it's taken 250 for chemical dependency. So that's something to think about. The internet is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. But there's something that the data are more compelling, and this isn't a surprise to anyone, it's cell phones. Kids get addicted to their cell phones. This isn't a surprise to anybody. Here's mine, right? I don't even put it down. So, kids get addicted to their cell phones. There's no question, same studies have been done looking at access to cell phones from kids who grew up in environments where they've had it, moved to environments where they don't, and they have all kinds of issues related to withdrawal. So there's no question about the issue that electronics, whether it's the internet or something like a cell phone, is at least in some way related to the changes that we're seeing in chemical dependency. So, when we started to look at chemical dependency, the first thing we looked at was caffeine. Not a surprise, no mystery to anybody. We picked caffeine because it's the #1 drug of abuse in the world today. #2 is alcohol, but it's not even in the same ballpark. So we just did some really simple studies with caffeine. And in doing so, we took advantage of the unique nature of the signal. All that means is, we're very interested in trying to understand what causes relapse. We know that the #1 cause of relapse to drug-seeking behavior are environmental triggers, cues. When you say that to a bunch of kids, you kind of get the response I'm getting here, like, what? What's going over there? What's an environmental cue? So let's just show you what I mean. I went out and I got 40 people who have no history of drug abuse, but they were going to be controls for our studies. I need people who have no history of drug abuse because I need controls, right? I need the 18-year-old who hasn't used, the 25-year-old, and they're controlled. What I required of them, though, was they had to like coffee. So I brought 40 people to my imaging center, controls. They signed informed consent for controls, and they had to like coffee. When I put them in the scanner, I brewed a pot of coffee in the next room. So I've got 40 people being scanned, and all of a sudden, they can smell coffee. And this is what we get. This is all 40 brains added up. This is a sagittal view of the human brain. Eyes are here, you're looking at the brain like this. Here, everyone's looking right at you. Here, eyes are here, feet are into the board. And what you see is 2 parts of the brain activate, turn on, and only 2 parts. You only see 1 part here, it's only half the brain. These 2 spots. The spots are called your nucleus accumbens. The name doesn't mean anything, but what it does means everything. It's the part of your brain that makes you get something you have to have. You use it every day. When you get up and you're thirsty, it's the part of your brain that turns on and tells you to get a drink. If you're hungry, it turns on and tells you to get food. If you're in a place that isn't safe, it turns on and tells you to seek safety. It's the part of your brain that is evolutionarily the oldest. It's the part of your brain that actually keeps you alive by maintaining your hydration and your appetite. But look what happens when you smell a drug that you like, coffee. It turns on and tells you to get the drug. So here's the deal. Whenever you use an addictive drug and you get this enormous increase in brain dopamine, your brain learns everything about the environment you're in. And anytime you re-experience any part of that environment, your brain incumbents turns on and tells you to get the drug that's associated with the response. So what do I hear? The thing I hear the most is music. I get high listening to Justin Bieber. I hear Justin, well, whatever. So you get high listening to Justin Bieber, and in a week you hear Justin Bieber again. There's the cue. You get high with your friend, and in 3 days you run into your friend. Things I hear all the time: ice being put in a glass, the clinking of ice in a glass, the sound of a beer opening, neon lights, neon writing. These are all cute. There's a reason that casinos are not quiet like churches or temples, right? There are tones and bells and lights and noises because your brain cues to those things. So the number one cause of relapse are environmental triggers. That's why the most effective treatment for this disease is to get somebody out of their environment into an environment where they have no cues that cause relapse. So cues can be the basement, if that's where they're using, the car, if that's where they're using, the beach, if they go and drink at the beach, the parking lot of a convenience store, if they go and, right? So it's something we know, and it's something we now can see. So we can show the kids exactly what it means. Environmental cues are the number one cause. So then the next question is, what is the effect of caffeine on the brain? Well, so we went out and we got a whole bunch of kids. We had them come to the imaging center, and we took a picture of their brain, and here it is. Eyes are right on top, normal PET scan. Then we gave those kids 1 can of Monster. Y'all know what Monster is? The 3 green lines? Ask your kids, they know what it is. They had 1 can of Monster to drink, 30 minutes to drink it, then we took another picture. And here's their brain. No surprise, absolutely predictable response. When you caffeinate your brain, it gets jacked up. I used to have a 2-hour commute on the LIE every day to work. I wanted my brain to be like this, not like this, because I didn't want to fall asleep and hit a bridge. So this was the metabolic state I wanted. Now, a couple things were surprising. One was the magnitude of the effect. That's huge. You never get your brain to be that active, unless you're 6. But people our age, your kids, don't get their brains this activated unless it's done with caffeine. So the magnitude of the effect was much greater than we anticipated. And the other thing that we didn't expect was the time course. I brought all the kids back the next day and scanned them 24 hours later, and their brain looked just like this. So we learned something that we knew, but now we can show them. And that is, whenever you use an addictive drug, it will change your brain for a lot longer than it changes how you feel. What that means is exactly what we know about the disease. A kid uses an addictive drug, they get an increase in brain dopamine. That increase falls away after about an hour, they feel nothing. So what do? They use again. Well, their brain is still changed. This takes 24 to 36 hours, a day and a half, for a single dose of caffeine. Well, so that was our first insight into the timing effects. Addictive drugs change the brain for a lot longer than they change how you feel. And if you use an addictive drug, in the presence of a brain that's changed from its use before, the process starts. Well, we learned something else. When your brain is this active, there's a fence around your brain called the blood-brain barrier. The way to think about it is it's a fence. It's a very special fence. And it's a fence that keeps other chemicals out. We all have it. It's a matter of life and death for us. You need your blood-brain barrier. When your brain is that active, the blood-brain barrier becomes less efficient. That means more things can get into your brain than normally do. All that means is, if you caffeinate your brain, and then you introduce another addictive substance, the other addictive substance becomes more addictive. Well, so they took advantage of that data set, and they made this stuff. You all know what 4-Loko is? 4-Loko, ask your kids. 4-Loko is caffeinated alcohol. And the reason they did it was because they knew if they introduced caffeine and alcohol together, you'll get a bigger effect of alcohol. So, ask your kids. Caffeinated alcohol becomes very popular. The most #1 mixed drink in New York City, Red Bull and vodka. Because kids know that you can consume less and get a bigger hit of alcohol because caffeine facilitates the transport of alcohol across the brain. It's no different than the incidence of people who drink coffee and smoke. Very high. So it's one thing to keep in mind that caffeine doesn't matter if it's from a piece of chocolate or a can of Coca-Cola, potentiates or increases the addictive liability of other drugs. So what I hear is kids say to me, I only drink coffee Monday through Friday. So I can drink alcohol on the weekends and I don't have to worry about the effect. But if you drink coffee on Friday, you have the effect of caffeine for a day and a half, which means if you drink alcohol Saturday night, you're still getting the effect, the additive effect of the caffeine you had 24 hours ago. So, just be aware that kids are drinking caffeinated alcohol, either Red Bull and vodka, or rum and Coke, or Four Loko. Tobacco, yes.
When you talk about coffee, how much are we talking about?
Right. So it's how much coffee are we talking about? We're talking about a single shot of espresso. A single shot of espresso. Right. So, coffee, tobacco. Kids know the deal with tobacco. Ask the kids about tobacco. They'll tell you that the risk of cancer is minimal. And if you look at the data, they're right. The risk of getting cancer from smoking cigarettes is about 7%. That means 93% of people don't. Now, 80% get cardiovascular disease and emphysema and all that kind of stuff, but the cancer risk is low and they know it. But they will also tell you that they're aware that 400 to 500,000 people a year die from tobacco-related incidents. So the question is, what does tobacco do to the human brain? So here's a study we did where we looked at that effect specifically. On the left is a 21-year-old girl, her eyes are right up here, non-smoker. In the center of her brain, as in the center of all your brains, is a chemical called monoamine oxidase. Doesn't matter what it is. We all have it. It's in the center of your brain, unless you smoke. If you consume a tobacco product, smoke a cigarette, smoke a pipe, smoke a cigar, chew tobacco, hookah, whatever it is, you consume tobacco, you'll destroy the monoamine oxidase in your brain. Period. Not 7% of you, not 50% of you, everyone. If you're exposed to secondhand smoke, you'll lose it too. So, there isn't anyone in this room who hasn't lost some MAO because we've all been exposed, at the very least, to secondhand smoke. Simple effect, dose dependent. Here's a kid who's never smoked. Takes 1 puff on a cigarette, 3 puffs, 1 cigarette, 3 cigarettes. Simple, dose-dependent, sex-independent boys and girls. So if you smoke a tobacco product, you lose monoamine oxidase. If you are exposed to secondhand smoke, you lose monoamine oxidase. This is the only effect you'll see tonight that's reversible. It comes back. So if you smoke for 50 years and quit, it comes back. It takes about 55 days, but it comes back. You smoke for a week and quit, it comes back. This is a reversible process. Now the question is, what does the chemical do? It's really simple. I told you that if I want to move anything, I have to release dopamine to allow that to happen. If I don't have dopamine, I'm going to get something like Parkinson's. Well, I need to be able to stop moving my fingers just as quickly as I start them. I stop the dopamine effect with this chemical. Monoamine oxidase is what inhibits or breaks down dopamine. So the way you can think of it is, that's the chemical that controls the amount of dopamine in your brain. Now, just take that to the next step. If I don't have it because I'm smoking cigarettes or I'm exposed to secondhand smoke, what does that mean? That means I can't control the amount of dopamine in my brain that's going to respond to an addictive drug. What does that mean? That means every addictive drug I use becomes more addictive because I don't have the chemical that takes dopamine away. So smoking potentiates or enhances or increases the addictive liability of all drugs. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the one that's a little more insidious. We now know that kids will tell us if they're adrenaline junkies or they're not. We know the difference between the two is the adrenaline junkies got 5% more dopamine than the other kid. Now we take a whole room of those other kids. These are the kids who are not going to try anything novel, they're not interested in bungee jumping, they're not interested in a hot air balloon. We send them all off to a party and we fill the room they're in with secondhand smoke. So now I've got a room full of kids who self-report that they're not interested in trying anything novel, consistent with their resting dopamine level, and they're starting to breathe in secondhand tobacco smoke. In about 60 minutes, their monoamine oxidase goes away. In about 90 minutes, their dopamine levels start to drift up as a consequence. And a little later than that, they've got about 5% more dopamine than when they walked in, because they don't have the chemical that controls it. So what does that mean? That means I've taken a whole bunch of kids who have dopamine levels consistent with a non-interest in trying something novel, raise their dopamine as a consequence of breathing in secondhand smoke, and all of a sudden I got kids who are willing to try something new. So I get kids who say to me, I don't know why the hell I did it. I went to a party and I thought, what the hell, try ecstasy. So now we know there's a really good set of data that speaks to the behavior of some kids who self-report a non-willingness to try something novel, but go ahead and try something novel simply as a consequence of exposure to secondhand smoke, knocking out their MAO, which causes an increase in brain dopamine. So, what did we do? We made this stuff, vaping. So everyone knows what's going on with vaping. There's no one who, it's not a mystery to anybody. We know what vapes are. You guys all know what Juuls are. If you don't, ask your kids. Everyone's Juuling. It looks like a USB drive. The first time I saw one, that's what I thought it was. Right? You can go and get these pens from all over the place. You can get the liquids from all over the place. And the predication for this behavior is based on a simple medical approach that was developed back in the 60s. And that is, back in the 60s, people were abusing heroin. So what they did was they developed and made a drug called methadone. Methadone is nothing more than a replacement strategy. You're going to get addicted to this drug, and to get it, you're going to commit crimes, do all kinds of horrible things to get. We're going to give you this drug, methadone, we're going to give it to you safely, we're going to give it to you at the right dose, we're going to want to make sure you take it when you're supposed to. It's called a replacement strategy. It's one of the oldest treatments in the book. We do it for nicotine. We make patches, we make gums, right? It's no different. So what they did was they made vapes. And what kids are starting to do is vape. And they're starting to vape nicotine. And one of the reasons they vape nicotine is because it completely circumvents, avoids, prevents, inhibits the effect. That means if you vape nicotine, you don't lose MAO. So, they developed it as a replacement strategy. You're going to take nicotine from tobacco, which kills 500,000 people a year. Why don't we just give you nicotine? So you don't have to get it through tobacco, so we don't have to worry about all the diseases associated with tobacco, and it works. Right? That's why kids are vaping nicotine, because one of the reasons it became so readily available is to get rid of the MAO effect. So, it's a simple event. People know what's going on. The physics, this is for my brother, the physics of vaping is really well understood. You take a liquid at a room temperature and you expose it to a heated metal coil. That heated metal coil causes the liquid to vaporize, turn into a gas, and you breathe it in. Simple. It's simple. It's older than the hills. The problem is, in order to get that coil heated to a sufficient temperature to vaporize the liquid, we need an energy source. Well, the energy source is the batteries that you recharge on your USB drive. Well, those energy sources have to be small. I don't want a vape that has a battery the size of a car battery. What the hell am I going to do with that? I need a vaping device that's small with a battery small enough. So I need to have metal that can be heated with the energy generated by a small battery. So what they did was they made the devices out of 3 metals: cadmium, nickel, and chromium. When you vape, It's no different than what happens on your kitchen stove. Whenever you introduce a liquid, whether it can be Poland Springs water or it can be juice from the vaping juice, you introduce that liquid to the heated metal coil, it causes the liquid to turn into a vapor that they breathe. But with that vapor, it brings nanoparticles of the metal that the vaping device is made of. Well, the metal is nickel, chromium, and cadmium. So kids are getting nanoparticles of those three metals. 10 years ago, we couldn't see nanoparticles. Now we can. Resolution's gotten better. We have new techniques, X-ray diffraction. We can see these nanoparticles now. So kids are starting to get exposed to and building up concentrations of the metals associated with the vaping device. Last week, Johns Hopkins just released a big report detailing the concentrations of nanoparticles in kids who are vaping. Next, kids tell me all the time that vaping is safe. It's steam. It's like going into a sauna. If you go and look at the liquids, the juices that they're vaping, what you'll see is they contain 10% water and 90% propylene glycol. So it's not steam. It's aerosolized propylene glycol. Now, propylene glycol is the stuff they use to de-ice plane wings. You can go and Google tonight propylene glycol, and you're going to find 500,000 articles that tell you you can fill your swimming pool with it and swim in it, it's safe. And you're going to find 500,000 articles that are going to tell you you're going to get tumors and seizures and brain disorders, the whole bit, which simply means we don't know. But what we do know is it's not steam. So when the kids say to you, it's just steam, it's not steam. It's propylene glycol. It's only 10% water. So it's something to be aware of. I try to tell the kids all the time, because I always hear it's like going into a sauna. It's not like going into a sauna. And saunas I've been to is pouring water over rocks, right? It's not pouring water over some big red metal coil. So just keep in mind that when kids are vaping, they're getting nanoparticles of those three metals that are deposited in their lungs, and they're getting aerosolized or vaporized propylene glycol. Now, one of the other things that's really compelling about this is we started this out by talking about, are there things we can look at that predict drug abuse? We talked a little bit about the internet and cell phones. Well, in the last few years, the thing that is the greatest predictor of using an illicit drug before you get out of high school is vaping. Kids who vape have the highest incidence of going on to other drugs of abuse. And kids who vape nicotine, almost 80% will go on to using tobacco. So, when we talk about back in the old days, I used to always hear that pot was the gateway drug. You smoke pot today, and by the weekend, you're going to be using heroin. If you look at the data, it's just not true. The data is just not there. It's not that pot is a gateway drug. If you want to look at a gateway drug, you want to look at a drug that is the most prevalent in people who are subsequently using other illicit drugs, it's inhalants, sniffing glue, dust off. Well, catching up to that is vaping. Kids who vape in 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade have the highest incidence of going on to illicit drug abuse before they get out of high school. Alcohol. So you'll be pleased to know that your kids knew every one of these things. There wasn't one of them they didn't know. They laughed at the beer funnel. They laughed at the shotgun. Many of them said they've done keg stands. And everyone knows the classic drinking game of beer pong. When I was in college, the game was quarters. You guys remember quarters? Your kids don't, but they remember beer pong. So, and everyone knows that the route of administration is a function of drug delivery. The faster you get the alcohol in, the faster you get the buzz from the drug. So it's a simple thing, the kids know it, there's no confusion, they know what's going on. But if you look over the last 7 years, the most rapidly increasing route of administration is this. What kids are doing is exactly what you think they're doing. They're eyeballing alcohol. It's now become the #1 drinking game in college campuses. And it's really simple, the kids know it. What kids are doing is they're typically taking clear alcohol, gin or vodka. They take the top off the bottle, put their eye in the bottle, tip it back, and they fill their eye with alcohol. Now, our eyes are normally filled with water. Aqueous humor, vitreous humor, it's water. When you hold that bottle up, you fill the eye with alcohol. And kids are getting hammered. Now, you might ask, why are they doing this? It's real simple. If you go to a party and you drink alcohol, and you leave that party and get in a car and drive away, and a cop pulls you over, he gives you a breathalyzer. 80% of the alcohol in a breathalyzer is from the alcohol that's left over in your mouth from drinking it. If you never drank it, but you put it in through your orbit, it doesn't show up on the breathalyzer. So the reason kids are doing it is to circumvent getting caught. Now, there's no mystery as to what's going on. Back in the old days, when my kids I'd stay up, or my wife would stay up waiting for the kids to come home, and the kids would come home and they'd have two bloodshot eyes, they'd say, man, the party was full of smoke, and you'd say, yeah, you're right, okay, good night. Now when kids come home and they've got one bloodshot eye, now it becomes a little more suspicious. Because alcohol's got a little different specific gravity than water, when your eye is filled with it, you can't see through that eye very well. So it's very uncommon for kids to do both eyes because they don't want to not see. Next, we know that the route of administration becomes really important for toxicity. The faster you get alcohol into your body, the more lethal it becomes. If you take a shot glass of alcohol and you drink it, on a 125-pound male or female, he or she may or may not feel it. But a shot glass of alcohol in your eye can be fatal because the alcohol goes directly into the vascular bed and you get a huge blood alcohol concentration. So what's going on is kids can consume less if they put it in through their eye. Now, if you look at data about the incidence of this, it's difficult to get a handle on because it's not obvious the kids tell us the truth. When we start to look at the prevalence of an event based on self-report, you got to take those data with a grain of salt because, you know, kids tend not to tell you the truth, how often they're doing it, the frequency. So when you look at numbers that are 7,500% increase in the eyeballing, take it with a grain of salt. What you can look at is the incidence of blindness, and that's up about 212%. Because what we know is kids who eyeball alcohol can lose their sight because alcohol is a drying agent and it's toxic to the retina. So, kids are learning this. They're still doing it. It's become really common. But they're starting to catch on. I've been talking about this long enough so kids will tell me, you know, they're concerned about the whole eyeballing thing in the sight. So what do you think they're switching to? They're going to this. Now, I did not talk about this today. I didn't talk about this today to your kids. I don't know why, but I didn't. But it's becoming more and more common. Now, the next thing is, it's more common in boys than it is in girls. So, it's exactly what you think it is. Now, the consequence is exactly the same, except you don't lose your sight. Women can become infertile, sterile. Men alcohol's a drying agent. It dries the colon. And when your colon dries, it tears. When your colon tears, it can become septic. Sepsis is just a systemic infection. #1 killer in hospitals. So, kids are tamping alcohol because there's no smell, there's no visual difference. A kid sits in class tamping alcohol, his eyes aren't bloodshot, right? It's become really common. Now, we know the consequence of it can be infertility in women, and it can be fatal in men. So let's take a look. The next thing that's going on, this is no surprise to anybody, you can talk to your kids about it, they're vaping alcohol. And the reason they vape alcohol is because it's the fastest way to get a buzz. in about 90 seconds. So kids can do it between period changes. If a period in high school is 3 minutes, they can go and vape alcohol in the bathroom and get buzzed in 90 seconds. So, this is the consequence of alcohol. Normal brain, 2 levels. Brain that's intoxicated. You can see the way to think about this is with caffeine. You slid the your brain lives on a dimmer switch, you slide it up, brain becomes bright red. With alcohol, you slide it down, and the brain becomes hypometabolic, which means the brain kind of slows down. It's metabolic, which is consistent with behaviors. It's consistent with what we know about the behavioral consequences of being intoxicated. What we didn't know was the same thing we didn't know with caffeine, and that was the time course. Unlike caffeine, where it's 24 to 36 hours to return to normal, with alcohol it's 5 to 7 days. So a single dose of alcohol changes the brain for about a week. That becomes consequential when you think about kids who say, I'm going to drink on the weekend so I'm ready for work on Monday or school on Monday. They're not. Their brain hasn't returned to normal. So they start out with a normal metabolic rate, they drink and it drops. 5 to 7 days later it returns. They drink and it drops. 5 to 7 days later it returns until they get to this. This is a 52-year-old male, normal PET scan, eyes are all on the top, normal control. 52-year-old male alcoholic who hasn't had a drink in over 20 years. What happens is at some point in the process, and that point depends on the age of onset of drinking and the pattern of drinking, the brain's metabolic rate stays at its hypometabolic state. That is, at some point in time, the brain says, that's it, I'm here. I'm never going back to here, not 5, I'm getting here. And the only way I'm going back to here is if I drink. This is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who's drunk when I took the picture, and his PET scan's normal. If you ask alcoholics why they drink, the number one answer is, I drink to feel normal. I don't drink to get drunk. That's exactly what we see in the metabolic signature. The alcoholic who drinks returns his brain's metabolic rate to a normal age-matched control value. So they're drinking to self-medicate the condition that alcohol induced in the first place. That's called a positive feedback loop. In biology, positive feedback loops are fatal. That is, the drug that produced the deficit becomes the treatment for the deficit. So they're now using the drug to treat what the drug produced. And I'm going to end on I'm going to end on opiates. We know what's going on with opiates. We know that part of the problem is physicians overwriting. We also know that people don't get addicted to opiates in the presence of pain. You get addicted to an opiate in the absence of pain. That's why the whole prescription thing became such a problem. If you fall down on the ice and you hurt your butt, and you go to your physician and he gives you 60 Vicodin, and you start taking Vicodin for the pain in your butt, and on day 3 the pain in your butt goes away, but you continue to take the Vicodin because you got 60 of them, that's when people get addicted. You don't get addicted in the presence of pain, you get addicted in the absence of pain. So what happens is kids go to pill parties, everyone knows what they are, and you take pills, you take an opiate, and you have no pain. So the addictive liability of opiates happens really quick. The opiate event is something that is extremely unique to opiates. Normal brain, 4 levels. Heroin abuser's brain, 4 levels. Brain slows down, not as much as alcohol, but something very unique happens. That blue spot and that blue spot. Part of your brain called the opercular cortex. The relevance doesn't mean anything, but what it does mean is it's the part of your brain that allows you to ascribe salience or relevance to everything in your life. So the other way to say this is it's the part of your brain that makes you give a crap, right? And if you don't have it, if it's not working, you don't care. So when I have my opiate abusers who come and I say to them, look, the next dose you take it at fentanyl and it's going to kill you. I don't care. Look what it's doing to your family. I don't care. It's not that they're bad people and don't care. It's that they've lost that part of their brain that allows them to care. The comparison here is the person who cuts their spinal cord. They can't walk. They want to walk, they know how to walk, they know they should walk, but they can't walk because the anatomical connections aren't there. In the opiate abuser, that part of the brain shuts off, so they lose the ability to ascribe salience or relevance to anything. Well, if you're someone who doesn't care about your actions and doesn't care whether you get treated, it becomes really difficult to treat. So I'm going to end there. I know we didn't cover every drug, but I'm happy to stay as late as you want me to stay to answer questions. Yeah.
Just real quick about the marijuana today with laces,
Right.
methamphetamine. I thought that was so.
Right. So, one of the drugs that the kids all know, because they all watch Breaking Bad, was methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a really simple drug to make. You go to CVS and Home Depot, you buy a couple of things and you can make it. It's cheap and it's prevalent. In its pure form, it looks like ice, hence the name crystal meth. If it's made with Robitussin, Triamnex, and Guanfacine, it's different colors. That doesn't matter. In fact, the point is, it's simple to make and it comes in different colors. This is my daughter Brittany when she was 12. And this was her brain when she was 12. You can see dopamine on both sides. That's what it should look like, brain in a 12-year-old kid. When you're 12, you even have dopamine up here in your frontal lobe. This is a 12-year-old kid who got into methamphetamine in her house and she ate it. And she gave herself Parkinson's disease, end-stage Parkinson's disease. Her 6-year-old sister's in the same place, same condition. My daughter is now 28, living in North Carolina, and she's 28. And she will live in a vegetative state the rest of her life as a consequence of methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is incredibly neurotoxic. It kills dopamine cells on contact. So, one of the things that we do is we've been taking in people in all of our protocols for years. Every year we bring in kids for pot, bring in kids for alcohol, bring in kids. In 2014, 2013, 2014, we were bringing in kids for pot. And strangely, they were testing positive for meth. And they'd all said they didn't use it, because if they said they had, they wouldn't have been included. Right? If I'm studying someone who's abusing pot, they can't tell me they're abusing 6 other drugs, it's gotta be just pot. Also, what we found was kids who were abusing pot were testing positive for meth. So then we actually tested their pot, and it had meth in it. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, pot was laced with PCP, angel dust. You couldn't find it that didn't have that in it. Today, it's really difficult to find pot that doesn't have meth in it. What the kids will tell you, what they tell me all the time, is the pot that's available today is much more potent than the pot that they had in the 60s. Well, if you go and look at the data, and you look at the THC concentration in pot from the 60s and pot from 2015, the difference in THC is a couple of milligrams, an amount you and I can't perceive. So it's got nothing to do with THC. What's happening is kids are getting a bigger jolt because it's got methamphetamine in it. It's laced. It's not a surprise. It's not a shock. Pot's been laced with stuff forever. What's happened is because methamphetamine is so cheap and so easy to make, it gets added to pot, and you can go ask your kids. They don't shop their pot. You don't go get pot where it's the cheapest, you get pot that's the best. And the best is not a consequence of more THC. Kids tell me, well, it's the stuff that's grown upside down in someone's basement in cat poop, hydrotonically, and it's got all this THC in it. Yeah, right, that's not it. You can go look at the concentrations of THC. It's not THC. It's methamphetamine that's added to it. So I've had kids say to me, after hearing you speak, we dump our pot out on the table and we pick the meth crystals out. If they're doing that, the problem's a lot worse than I thought. Yeah.
What concern do you have for someone who's sitting here now with a concern about a behavior they have? What would be the first step you would suggest?
For what kind of behavior?
Substance abuse issue.
I'd hang, no. My concern, so, you mean what?
Someone is sitting here and they're concerned. What would be the first outreach?
Talk to the kid. One of the things I've learned is kids, and I know there are a lot of kids here, a couple things you don't want to do is you don't want to BS. Kids got the BS radar working real well. They can pick up BS real well. So one of the things I've always thought is you have to talk to them. You've got to engage them in what's going on. You gotta, I know it's difficult, I'm a parent, it's difficult to not be judgmental, but it's kind of essential not to be judgmental. You need to find out what's going on, because many kids, one of the things I've learned over the years is many kids think that there's no consequence to using a drug. And what do I hear? I have friends who've been smoking pot forever. I have friends who've been drinking forever and they're all fine. The fact of the matter is, fine is a nebulous definition. What does fine mean? The first thing I would do is I would talk to the kid. I would try to find out what's going on and educate them. Many kids will say, well, I'm just smoking pot. Well, then why do you have tremors of intention? You shouldn't have tremors of intention if you're smoking just pot. Because you have tremors of intention, that means there's something going on. Either you're not telling me the other drug you're using, or the pot you're smoking isn't pure pot. So I would talk to the kids, and that's the first thing. I'm a big believer in talking to the kids and trying to not be judgmental, trying to engage them in an adult conversation. I'd like to tell you that I have the answer, but I don't. That's what I think. Yes?
The presentation that you gave at middle schools
It was amazing today.
was it what you showed this evening?
Yeah, minus the tampons. It was amazing. I had a great question. I had a kid say, the kid said, what about the humidifier that's in my room? I know. I thought, wow, what a great question. Well, if you look at humidifiers today, they're not heat, they're cold. So they're blowing air over the surface of water, which generates the steam. But it was like, that question, I thought, wow, I'd never had that question. I had amazing questions for this school kid. Same presentation, I didn't go into the ADD thing and the adrenaline junkie thing, because I didn't have time. So I didn't go into that. I did do the I did the iPhone. I didn't do the tampon. And I didn't do the vaping of alcohol.
I think this is the most significant thing, is kids take all the that's the best one,
Right.
that is.
It's really dangerous. So kids will ask, kids will say, that supports, and people have used the idea that because of the contamination problem, that's why you should legalize pot. I hear it every day. If I can go buy pot at CVS, it's not going to have meth in it. And they're right. They're right. Here's the problem. If you go and look at states where it has the highest concentration of stuff that's not pure, Colorado. People go to the CVS, buy it, lace it, and resell it. So, yeah. There any, yeah.
I've heard in the past that addiction can run in the family. So with that,
Right.
what do they just do?
Right. So the question she asked, she said she's heard that addiction can run in the family. So the only genetic data that we have that is consistent, we've identified a gene for it, is alcoholism. Kids born of a single alcoholic parent have about a 30% greater likelihood of having the gene for alcoholism. That does not mean that that gene will express and 30% of the kids will become alcoholics. It simply means that about 30% of kids born of a single alcoholic parent might have a different response to alcohol. So, I get asked this all the time. The only genetic link we have found so far that we can identify the gene is alcoholism. Next, we know that kids who are in utero, when mom uses an opiate, 2 kids every hour of every day are born addicted to opiates. 2 kids an hour in the United States. We know those kids have a much higher likelihood of having the disease of addiction. The other drugs, mom's using meth, dad's using cocaine, we've never found a genetic link. One of the things that confounds that data set is environment. If you're raised in an environment where there's drugs around, the likelihood of addiction goes up. So that simply means there's the genetic component that we've seen with alcohol, and there is an environmental component that we see too. So there's clearly a genetic link for alcohol that we've seen. There's a genetic component to opiates if the baby's exposed in utero.
Go over with the kids, that pot is pretty, people use it. What about the effect on young kids?
Right. Well, we didn't talk about pot because we didn't have time.
Nothing. In high school, we talked about marijuana.
The data with pot is interesting in that it's very specific. So one of the things we looked at was this. So the front part of your brain doesn't finish growing up until you're 23 or 24, right? Your brain continues to grow the front of it, the part just above your eyes, your frontal lobe, until you're about 23 or 24. That means the cells are growing, then they're getting bigger. If you introduce THC to the brain during this period, adolescence, then you arrest, you stop the frontal lobe from growing. It's really simple. You smoke pot during adolescence, the part of your brain that's growing stops growing. Now, if you quit smoking pot, it'll start to grow. So if you start smoking pot at 15 and quit when you're 25, at 25 you've got a frontal lobe that's got the synaptic density of a 15-year-old, but it'll grow. Frontal lobe is the part of your brain that makes you who you are, it's your personality. If you arrest development of your frontal lobe, personality development lags. It's also the part of your brain that's your go, no-go response. It's the part of your brain that allows you to make executive decisions. Executive decision is defined as something where a data set, where you're making a decision based on data. So the classic example is the 16-year-old kid is driving his car or her car, approaching an intersection with a traffic light, and the traffic light turns orange. What does a 16-year-old kid do? Steps on the gas and flies through the intersection. What do? I look for the cop first. Then I look to see if there's someone right on my butt. So if I slam on the brakes, he's not going to hit me. In other words, when your frontal lobe is developed, you allow data that impacts your decision to enter into your decision. So what happens is when kids are smoking pot during adolescence, they're delaying their ability to integrate data points into the decision. The other thing the frontal lobe does is it timestamps things. Adults, everything is timestamped. If you go and ask a high school kid, what's the future? They'll tell you it's tonight. You and I, the future is some time, right? Because we have a concept of time that's different than they have, not because they don't want it, but because their frontal lobe isn't developed. There's an interesting statistic that I've never forgotten. If you can avoid using an addictive substance until your frontal lobe is developed, so avoid using an addictive substance until you're 23 or 24, the probability that you'll get addicted to anything the rest of your life is less than 1%. Because addiction is a disease that unmasks during adolescence. Kids become addicted during adolescence. It may not manifest with the behavior of addiction until they're 30 or 40, but the unmasking of the disease occurs during adolescence when they introduce an addictive substance to a developing brain. Yeah.
What is the effects on the brain between regular marijuana and the synthetic kind that these kids are now getting?
Right. So the synthetic kind is spice, K2. So the first thing to clear up is it's not synthetic pot. They say it's synthetic pot, it's not. A cannabinoid, it's not an endocannabinoid, it has no relation to cannabinoids. It was made for a simple reason. It was designed to produce the similar behavior that pot produces without showing up as a positive pot test for your urine. So, spice is synthetic, means it's not plant-based, it doesn't come from a plant, it's added to potpourri, and it's added to stuff from your lawnmower bag. It's added to that, it's not part of that. Now, it does the same thing that every other drug does, it raises brain dopamine. But it does it, I said, they all increase dopamine, they do it through different mechanisms. The mechanism that spice embraces is something called anoxia. It deprives your brain of oxygen, which causes dopamine levels to rise. So, your brain's Achilles heel is oxygen. You can play in the NFL, you can be a boxer, you can do all kinds of things, and your brain is resilient, plastic, and recovers. Its Achilles heel is oxygen. When you deprive your brain of oxygen, cells die immediately. So the consequence of spice, it's so dangerous because it's causing cell death with every use. Well, so what does that mean? Well, where do you look? You kind of look in the part of the brain that's got the richest blood supply, which is the front. So when kids use spice, they're killing off their frontal lobe. When you start to kill off your frontal lobe, that's your personality. You get profound changes in behavior. Kids become incredibly aggressive, agitated, paranoid. As a consequence of their frontal lobe starting to actually degenerate as a consequence of the loss of oxygen. Spice is one of the really bad ones because it's like meth. It produces an acute effect with each dose that can manifest with each dose. Yep.
What about the TLC that's in vaping devices?
Right. So kids, she asked, what about the THC in vaping devices? So kids are using, they're dabbing, so they're using, you know, this is no mystery. In the old days, they used to make tar, right? What was the drug that movie Midnight Express? What was it?
Hash.
Hash. Thanks. We'll talk later. She's right there. Raise your hand. Hash. So what they've done is they've extracted the oil, the active ingredient in pot is THC, it's an oil. And you can extract it with butane. Butane is a gas that's used quite commonly to extract THC oil to make hash, tie sticks. So what kids are doing is they're taking that oil and they're using it in vapes. Now, one of the things that vapes do very efficiently is they burn at a lower temperature than a cigarette burns, so they become more efficient. In other words, when they vape THC or they vape nicotine, the unit is far more efficient at aerosolizing those compounds, so in other words, you get a bigger dose. So vaping THC or vaping nicotine, you get a bigger dose. Drug dependency is a dose response curve. The higher the dose, the more rapid people become dependent. So when they're vaping THC, or they're dabbing, which just means they're putting it directly on the coil, they get hooked faster because the dose is bigger. Yeah.
Is there an effect of secondhand vape?
Yeah, absolutely. Secondhand vape. Yeah, absolutely. Same thing. Remember, so whenever we talk about secondhand smoke, it's like everything else. It's a function of dose. The kid doing it is getting the bigger dose than the kid breathing it in. Secondhand vape is, when you walk behind the cloud of vape, you're getting a lower dose, but you're still getting a dose. All right, thanks. Thank you very much.
Before you leave, I'll embarrass Dr. Dewey for just a moment and remind him that I first met his acquaintance 15 years ago when his daughter Brittany was in the 6th grade and I was her elementary principal. Our first meeting was actually when he came in to ask me some questions about the 6th grade health curriculum. And that didn't go well for me because this is a lot like what it sounded like, and we eventually caught up and had a great relationship. But I want to thank Steve for coming to Elwood and sharing his wisdom. I want to thank all the parents that are here. Thank you for demonstrating your concern for our students and your children. Dr. Dewey has presented in lots of districts. When we booked him to speak to the kids, he was more than happy to do it. When I mentioned to him that we wanted to have a parent component, he warned me that in some other places, he spoke to rooms of 8, 9, 10 parents. I assured him that would not be the case here, and you proved me right. So thank you for your parent concern. For our students who listened to the presentation both earlier today and tonight, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking your time for yourself. Everybody get home safely. Thank you.
Guys, make sure the students pick up your certificates. Mr. Shanahan has them for your community service. Thank you.